When Reverend Thomas Keepart opened the church door that October morning in 1904, he found 2 empty seats where Sarah Holcomb and Ida Whitfield always sat together. Their songbooks were lying side by side, still open to the same page. By evening, search groups would find out why the women had disappeared, and the truth would split Watauga County for many years to come. Before we start the story, if you love learning about forgotten histories and the lives of people who loved each other against all odds, click the like button and subscribe. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Drop it in the comments. Now, let's continue with the story. The paper recorded at the Watauga County Courthouse in March of 1902 listed both names in neat handwriting. Sarah Elizabeth Holcomb and Ida Mae Whitfield had bought 14 acres of mountain land 3 miles outside Boone, North Carolina for $67. The clerk had stopped before writing, spinster companions, in the relationship column, but no other word seemed right for 2 unmarried women in their 30s who wanted to live together. Their cabin sat in a valley where laurel bushes grew so thick that sunlight barely touched the forest floor. Sarah had learned carpentry skills from her father, and the house she built showed careful work. Neighbors who visited noticed the single bedroom, the 2 rocking chairs placed close enough that the women could hold hands while watching the evening settle over the mountains. Some found it unusual. Most chose not to think about it at all. Sarah stood nearly 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders and rough hands of someone used to hard work. She kept her dark hair cut short, saying it was easier for farm work. Ida was smaller, quieter, with reddish-brown hair she wore in a simple braid. She had been a school teacher before the school board decided that her personality made her wrong for teaching children. The official reason given was not enough money, but everyone knew the real cause. She had said no to 3 marriage proposals in 2 years, and people talked. The women raised chickens, kept a large garden, and sold eggs and preserves at the Boone market every Saturday. They went to services at the Baptist church without fail, sitting in the same seat, their voices mixing during songs in a harmony that some found beautiful and others found uncomfortable. They never spoke about their living arrangement, never explained themselves to anyone. In the isolated valleys of Watauga County, where families lived miles apart and survival required working together, 2 women farming together should not have been strange. But it was strange. The way Sarah's hand stayed on Ida's shoulder when she thought no one was watching. The way Ida's face changed when Sarah entered a room. The way they moved through their shared life with a closeness that went beyond what the mountain community understood as friendship. People noticed, though most kept their thoughts private. In 1902, there were no words for what Sarah and Ida were to each other. At least no words spoken in polite company. For 2 years, an uneasy peace held. Then Sarah's brother-in-law came home from the logging camps and everything changed. The letters discovered in 1998 tell the story that neighbors only whispered about. Kept safe in a trunk that lasted 3 generations, the letters between Sarah and Ida show something the mountain community either couldn't see or refused to see. "My dearest heart," Sarah wrote in April of 1903. "When I wake beside you, I understand what it means to be truly alive." Ida's answer was equally clear. "I would rather face punishment with you than heaven without you." They had met at a church gathering in 1899. Sarah had just lost her parents to typhoid fever. Ida had recently been let go from her teaching job. Both women faced uncertain futures in a society that expected them to marry, have children, and disappear into the background of men's lives. Instead, they found each other. By 1903, their shared life had developed its own quiet rhythms. Sarah worked the land while Ida ran the household and took in sewing to add to their money. On Sunday evenings, they read aloud to each other from books borrowed from the traveling library. Local women who visited for eggs sometimes saw them through the window, heads bent together over a single book, and felt something they couldn't quite name. Jealousy perhaps, or seeing a bond their own marriages lacked. But acceptance in Watauga County was always temporary. It depended on being quiet, on keeping up the appearance of proper behavior even when everyone suspected otherwise. As long as Sarah and Ida remained quiet and caused no trouble, they could exist on the edges of acceptable behavior. Luther Holcomb's return in May of 1904 destroyed that fragile peace. Sarah's older sister, Martha, had married Luther 12 years earlier, giving birth to 4 children before dying in childbirth with the 5th. Luther had left the children with Martha's mother and gone to the logging camps in Tennessee, sending money but never visiting. Now he was back 38 years old and looking for a wife to raise his children. He appeared at Sarah and Ida's cabin on a Tuesday afternoon, his wagon loaded with his belongings. The story kept in oral histories describes how he stood in their doorway, hat in hand, and told Sarah it was time she did her duty to the family. Martha's children needed a mother. Sarah was unmarried and almost 35. The answer was obvious. Sarah's refusal was immediate and absolute. Luther's reaction, according to people who later testified, was equally fast. He called her selfish, unnatural, sinful. He pointed at Ida and said things that made even tough mountain men uncomfortable when they heard the story repeated. Then he left, but not before promising to return. The community's response showed where sympathies lay. At the general store, men nodded when Luther complained about his stubborn sister-in-law. Women clucked their tongues and said it was shameful. A perfectly capable woman refusing to help raise her own sister's children. Only a few voices, mostly other unmarried women, suggested that Sarah had the right to live as she chose. Luther began visiting the cabin weekly, then twice weekly. Each time his demands grew louder and his language more threatening. Sarah wrote about these visits in letters to friends in Boone, letters that would later prove important. He says, "I'm living in sin." She wrote to a former school teacher who had known Ida. He says he'll make me see reason one way or another. In June, Luther tried a different approach. He went to Reverend Keepart and asked the church to step in. The minister, uncomfortable with the situation but unwilling to ignore a church member's request, visited the cabin. What happened during that conversation was never fully recorded, but Keepart came out looking shaken. He never spoke publicly about what the women told him, but he also never returned to pressure them about Luther's demands. By late summer, Luther's visits had taken on a darker quality. He no longer asked, he demanded, threatened, and on one occasion, according to a letter Ida wrote to her cousin in Tennessee, he waited outside their cabin until well after dark, watching the windows. Sarah bought a shotgun from the general store. The clerk later remembered that her hand shook when she counted out the money. The mountain community watched this slow disaster approaching and did nothing to stop it. Some blamed Sarah for her stubbornness. Others blamed Luther for his persistence. Almost no one admitted that two women might have the right to live undisturbed, to build a life together without interference. That possibility existed outside the boundaries of what most people in Watauga County could imagine. By October, something had to break. Everyone sensed it. They just didn't know how terrible the breaking would be. The sheriff's record book for 1904 contains 3 entries that would haunt Watauga County for decades. The first, dated June 23rd, records Sarah Holcombe's complaint that Luther Holcombe had threatened her on her own property. The second, from August 7th, notes that he had followed the women into Boone and confronted them outside the general store. The third, filed September 19th, describes how he had blocked the road to the cabin with his wagon, refusing to let them pass until Sarah agreed to discuss her duties. Sheriff Edmund Yates wrote a single word after each entry counseled. What that counseling involved, no record shows. Luther continued his campaign without stopping. The law in 1904 offered little protection for women, and even less for women whose lives went against social expectations. A brother-in-law demanding family responsibility seemed reasonable to most people. 2 women living alone, refusing marriage, choosing each other over duty, that seemed unreasonable. The September incident had been witnessed by 3 people. Isaac Bingham, who farmed the next property over, later testified that he heard Luther shouting about wickedness and sin. He also heard Luther say something that made his blood cold. "One way or another, this ends soon." Bingham did nothing. When asked why during the trial, he said he figured it was family business and not his concern. This attitude was common. In isolated mountain communities, people minded their own business unless directly threatened. Sarah and Ida's danger seemed theoretical, a family dispute that would eventually solve itself. But the women knew better. A letter Ida wrote to her cousin Margaret in Knoxville, dated October 1st, reveals their growing fear. "We sleep with the shotgun beside the bed now. Sarah checks the doors 3 times each night. Yesterday, we found one of our chickens dead in the yard, its neck wrung. It may have been a fox, but we both know it wasn't. He wants us to understand that he can reach us whenever he chooses." The letter continued with heartbreaking clarity. "If something happens to us, Margaret, know that we chose this life with open eyes. We chose each other over safety, over acceptance, over everything the world said we should want. I have never regretted a single day with Sarah, even now, even afraid I would make the same choice again." Margaret received this letter on October 20th, 5 days after the women disappeared. She immediately brought it to Sheriff Yates, who read it once and set it aside. The letter wasn't entered into evidence until decades later. On October 9th, Luther made his position public. At the Sunday service, he stood during the announcements and asked the congregation to pray for his sister-in-law, who he claimed was lost to righteousness and enslaved by unnatural affection. Several people later recalled that he looked directly at Sarah and Ida when he spoke. Reverend Keepart tried to redirect the conversation, but the damage was done. After the service, a group of women approached Sarah and Ida in the churchyard. Most came to offer quiet support, pressing their hands and saying nothing, their solidarity necessarily silent. But one woman, Constance Riddle, spoke loud enough for others to hear. "You should leave," she said. "Take your things and go somewhere people don't know you. He's not going to stop." Sarah thanked her but shook her head. "This is our home. We built it together. We won't be driven from it." Ida later told her cousin that she disagreed with Sarah's decision but couldn't bring herself to argue. Leaving would mean abandoning everything they'd created, admitting that their love had no right to exist in the mountains they both called home. They had already given up so much to live authentically. Their land, their cabin, their garden, these things mattered. To run would be another kind of death. The last documented threat came on October 12th. Luther appeared at their cabin just after dawn, before they'd finished breakfast. A neighbor traveling the road heard him shouting that he would cure Sarah of her sickness and that Ida would be driven from the county by force if necessary. When Sarah came out with the shotgun, he laughed. "You won't use that," he said. "You're not capable of what needs doing, but I am." He left them standing in their doorway, the autumn wind already carrying the first hint of winter. 3 days later, they would both be dead. October 15th, 1904, dawned cold and clear over Watauga County. Frost covered the mountain laurel, and wood smoke rose from chimneys throughout the valley. It was the kind of morning that promised winter's approach, the kind that made people grateful for warm fires and solid roofs. For Sarah Holcomb and Ida Whitfield, it was their last morning alive. They attended church as always. 7 witnesses later confirmed their presence at the Baptist service that began at 900. Constance Riddle sat 2 rows behind them and noticed that both women seemed tense, their backs stiff, their song books gripped tighter than necessary. During the opening prayer, she saw Sarah reach over and briefly squeeze Ida's hand, a gesture so quick that anyone not watching closely would have missed it. Reverend Keypart's sermon that morning focused on forgiveness and Christian charity. Several church members later wondered if he'd chosen the topic deliberately, knowing the tension that had been building. About 40 minutes into the service, during the 3rd hymn, Sarah and Ida stood suddenly and left through the side door. The Reverend paused mid-verse, watching them go. He later testified that he saw fear on their faces, though he couldn't explain what had caused their departure. Isaac Bingham was leaving the service to use the outhouse when he noticed Luther Holcomb's wagon parked on the road leading towards Sarah and Ida's cabin. The wagon was empty, but the horse was still hitched, suggesting Luther hadn't gone far. Bingham checked his pocket watch. It was 10:20 in the morning. What happened between that moment and noon remains partially hidden by time and conflicting accounts, but certain facts came out during the investigation. A traveling salesman named James Walsh was making his way along the Ridge Road when he came across Luther's wagon around 11:30. Luther sat on the driver's bench, his clothes messy and his face flushed. When Walsh asked if he needed help, Luther waved him on without speaking. Walsh later told investigators that Luther's hands were shaking and that he seemed to be extremely upset. By early afternoon, other details began surfacing. A farmer's wife named Helen Pritchard had been gathering late-season apples from a tree near the road when she heard what sounded like shouting coming from the direction of Sarah and Ida's cabin. She couldn't make out words, but she recognized a woman's voice calling out, then silence. The time, she guessed, was around noon or slightly after. She mentioned this to her husband that evening, but didn't think to report it immediately. Mountain people were used to keeping their distance from others' business. When Sarah and Ida failed to appear at the Sunday evening church social, Constance Riddle felt the first flutter of real alarm. The women never missed social events. They brought preserves and helped prepare the shared meal. Their absence was notable. She mentioned her concern to Reverend Keypart, who promised to check on them the following morning. But Keypart didn't need to make that journey. On Monday morning, a 12-year-old boy named Thomas Gaither was hunting rabbits in the woods near Grievance Creek when his dog began barking wildly at the edge of a steep cliff. Thomas approached carefully and saw what the dog had found. 2 bodies lay at the bottom of the rocky slope, partially hidden by brush and fallen leaves. Thomas ran 3 miles to the nearest farm and gasped out what he'd seen. Within an hour, Sheriff Yates and 6 men reached the cliff. Getting down to the bodies required ropes and considerable effort. The scene they found would be burned into their memories for the rest of their lives. Sarah and Ida lay together among the rocks and autumn leaves. Their church clothes were torn and stained. The injuries they had suffered were severe, though the exact nature would only be detailed in the coroner's report. What struck everyone who saw them, what appeared in every witness statement and newspaper account, was that their hands were clasped together. Even in death, they had not let go of each other. Sheriff Yates examined the area above the cliff where the bodies appeared to have fallen from. There was no clear path down. The women would have had to be near the edge of the steep drop to have fallen. Yet there was no reason for them to be in that location at all. It was a quarter mile from any trail and more than 2 miles from their cabin. The undergrowth showed signs of trouble, broken branches and scuffed earth, suggesting a struggle had happened. It was later reported that the sheriff believed he understood what had happened, though official records do not specify his conclusions. The only question was whether he could prove it. By Tuesday morning, Luther Holcomb was in custody. He had not run away, he had not hidden. He was at his mother-in-law's house, sitting at the kitchen table. When the sheriff arrived to arrest him, he came without fighting back, speaking only once during the journey to the jail. "They gave me no choice," he said. Those 5 words would define the trial to come. The county coroner, Dr. Benjamin Stokes, performed his examination on October 17th in the basement of the Boone Courthouse. His official report, kept in the county archives and largely unexamined until the 1990s, contains details that contradicted the story many people wanted to believe. Both women had suffered injuries consistent with violence, indicating a violent struggle. According to reports, the damage was focused on their heads and upper bodies. Dr. Stokes noted defensive wounds on their hands and arms, indicating they had tried to protect themselves. He also documented bruising on both women's wrists, suggesting they had been forcibly grabbed or held with significant strength. The critical finding appeared in the report's 3rd paragraph. The pattern and location of the injuries made it impossible that the women had died from falling down the cliff. Dr. Stokes's notes indicated the injuries were consistent with foul play, suggesting the fall alone likely did not cause their deaths. He also noted something else that would become significant during the trial. Soil samples taken from the women's clothing and shoes contained red clay consistent with the area near their cabin, not the grey mountain soil found around the cliff. They had been attacked elsewhere. then moved or chased to the location where their bodies were discovered. The search of Sarah and Ida's cabin, conducted on October 18th, revealed more troubling evidence. The interior showed signs of a violent disturbance. A table had been turned over. Broken dishes covered the kitchen floor. Most significantly, the shotgun Sarah had purchased was missing, never to be recovered. Their few items of value, including a silver locket Ida wore daily and a small amount of money they kept in a tin, were also gone. Sheriff Yates found something else during the search. Tucked beneath the mattress in the bedroom were dozens of letters between Sarah and Ida, their correspondence from the years before they had begun living together. The sheriff read enough to understand the nature of their relationship, then carefully gathered every letter and locked them in his office safe. He would later claim they were irrelevant to the case. In truth, he knew they would make the women unsympathetic to a jury. The community's reaction to the deaths split along predictable lines. Many expressed shock and horror that such violence had occurred in their quiet county. Church services that Sunday were heavily attended, with Reverend Keepart delivering a sermon about the sacredness of life and the sin of taking another's existence. But other voices were less sympathetic. At Morrison's general store, conversations took a darker turn. Some men suggested that Luther, while perhaps excessive in his methods, had been defending his family's honor. Women who had always viewed Sarah and Ida with suspicion now spoke more freely about their discomfort with the women's arrangement. The phrase, "they brought it on themselves," appeared in several letters and diary entries from that period. Constance Riddle organized a group of women to prepare the bodies for burial. When she arrived at the undertaker's establishment, she found that no family members had come forward to claim Ida. Sarah's brother-in-law was in jail, and her remaining family refused to acknowledge her. The women would have been buried in paupers' graves if Constance and her companions hadn't stepped in. The preparation of the bodies revealed one final detail that Constance never spoke of publicly, but confided to her daughter years later. When they tried to separate Sarah and Ida's hands for individual burial, rigor mortis had set in so completely that they couldn't be parted without causing damage. They had died holding each other, and even death had not loosened their grip. The women made a decision that some in the community criticized, but that Constance defended until her own death 40 years later. They positioned the bodies together in Sarah's family plot, their hands still joined before rigor mortis released. Constance paid for the burial herself when Sarah's family refused. The simple headstone she commissioned read only their names and dates, nothing about their relationship or the manner of their deaths. On October 23, 1904, days after their deaths, Sarah Holcomb and Ida Whitfield were laid to rest before a small gathering of mourners. Luther Holcomb sat in the county jail 3 miles away, awaiting trial. He had said nothing since his arrest beyond those 5 words, "They gave me no choice." The question now was whether a jury would agree with him. In Watauga County in 1904, with attitudes toward women like Sarah and Ida ranging from tolerance to disgust, the answer was far from certain. The prosecutor, newly appointed and only 28 years old, faced a task that seemed nearly impossible. He had to convince 12 men that 2 women who went against every social rule deserved justice, that their lives had value, that their deaths demanded accountability. His name was William Hutchkins, and the trial would define his career and divide the county for generations. Luther Holcomb's arrest divided Watauga County more cleanly than any election or church split ever had. The Boone newspaper, the Watauga Democrat, received more letters in the weeks following the arrest than it had published in the previous year. The editor, reluctant to fuel controversy, printed only a fraction of them, but the ones he selected revealed the depth of the community split. "A man has the right to defend his family's honor," wrote one writer who signed only as concerned citizen. Another letter from a woman who gave her full name, Martha Vance, argued the opposite. "No honor is defended through violence against those who cannot defend themselves. We have become a county that punishes women for the crime of living freely." The arrest itself had been orderly, almost anticlimactic. Luther had offered no resistance when Sheriff Yates appeared at his mother-in-law's house on October 17th. He had been sitting at the kitchen table, still wearing the same clothes he'd worn to church 2 days earlier. His mother-in-law, Eleanor Holcomb, had protested his arrest so strongly that the sheriff later described her as more upset than the prisoner himself. In custody, Luther maintained an unsettling calm. The deputy assigned to watch him reported that he slept soundly, ate his meals without complaint, and spent his waking hours reading from a Bible that Eleanor had brought him. He received visitors daily, mostly men from the church who came to offer support and prayer. Several of these men later testified as character witnesses at his trial. The evidence against Luther was substantial but circumstantial. Multiple witnesses had seen his wagon near the women's cabin on the morning of their disappearance. The salesman, James Walsh, testified that Luther had been extremely distressed when encountered on the road. Most damning was Dr. Stokes's report, which made it clear that the women had been attacked, not killed accidentally. But prosecutor William Hutchkins faced an obstacle that went beyond evidence. He had to make a jury of 12 mountain men care about the deaths of 2 women whose relationship violated every social norm they understood. In strategy meetings with Sheriff Yates, Hutchkins argued that the case should focus purely on the facts of murder, avoiding any mention of Sarah and Ida's private life. Yates disagreed. "You can't avoid it," the sheriff said. "The defense will make their relationship central to everything. They'll argue Luther was protecting his family from scandal, from sin, If you don't address it, you lose. Hutchkins spent sleepless nights wrestling with this problem. The letters he'd been shown from Sarah and Ida's cabin made their bond unmistakable, but introducing them as evidence would likely harm his case more than help it. Jurors in 1904 would not view a romantic relationship between two women with sympathy. They would view it with disgust, confusion, or religious condemnation. The defense attorney, Samuel Birch, had no such complications. A respected lawyer from Wilkesboro who had won several high-profile cases, Birch arrived in Boone with a clear strategy. He would not deny that Luther had killed the women. Instead, he would argue that Luther's actions, while regrettable, were understandable given the unnatural circumstances that had driven him to violence. Birch met with Luther only twice before the trial. In his private notes, discovered years later among his papers, he wrote, "The client shows no remorse for his actions. He believes firmly that he acted righteously in removing what he describes as a moral corruption from his family's name. This certainty will either save him or condemn him depending on how the jury views the victims." The community's division showed up in unexpected ways. When Constance Riddle attempted to organize a petition demanding justice for Sarah and Ida, she found willing signatures from 36 women, but was confronted by angry crowds at the general store. Someone threw a rock through her window one night, though no one was ever charged. Her husband, a quiet farmer who had stayed out of the controversy, finally asked her to stop for the safety of their family. Reverend Keepart received similar pressure from both sides. Church members demanded he take a public position on the case. Some wanted him to condemn Luther's violence. Others wanted him to acknowledge that Sarah and Ida's lifestyle had caused the tragedy. He chose silence, which satisfied no one and cost him the respect of many parishioners. By November, the tension in Boone had grown so thick that Sheriff Yates requested help from the state to maintain order during the trial. The governor declined, stating that local authorities were sufficient. Yates increased his deputy force anyway, recruiting 6 temporary lawmen to keep peace in the courtroom. The trial was scheduled to begin on December 5, 1904. Every hotel room in Boone and the surrounding towns filled with people coming to witness what newspapers were already calling the trial of moral conscience. Hutchkins prepared his case knowing that he faced not just a defense attorney but an entire community's discomfort with women who had dared to live outside acceptable boundaries. Luther Holcomb, meanwhile, continued reading his Bible in his cell, confident that any jury of reasonable men would understand why he had done what he'd done. The Watauga County Courthouse could seat 90 people, but more than 200 tried to enter on December 5, 1904. Sheriff Yates stationed deputies at every door, admitting only those with legitimate business or press credentials. The crowd that couldn't get inside gathered in the town square, waiting for news from those who came out during breaks. Judge Harrison Caldwell, 63 years old and known for his stern manner, presided. He began by warning both attorneys and spectators that he would tolerate no outbursts, no demonstrations, and no behavior that disrupted the dignity of his courtroom. Then he ordered the jury selection to begin. Finding 12 impartial men proved nearly impossible. Every potential juror had heard about the case and most had formed opinions. Prosecutor Hutchkins eliminated anyone who expressed open sympathy for Luther. Defense attorney Birch eliminated anyone who showed concern for the victim's welfare. After 2 full days, they seated a jury of farmers, shopkeepers, and tradesmen, none of whom had known the women personally. Hutchkins opened his case on December 7th with a strategy he'd agonized over for weeks. He would present the evidence of murder while saying as little as possible about why the women had died. "This case is about 2 facts," he told the jury. On October 15th, Sarah Holcomb and Ida Whitfield were alive. By that evening, they were dead, their bodies bearing wounds that could only have been inflicted by another person. The state will prove that Luther Holcomb was responsible for their deaths. He called Dr. Stokes first. The coroner's testimony was clinical and devastating. He described the injuries in medical terms that made several jurors visibly uncomfortable. When Hutchkins asked if the women could have gotten such wounds from a fall, Dr. Stokes was clear: impossible. These injuries were inflicted by a person wielding a heavy object with considerable force. The victims attempted to defend themselves, as shown by the wounds on their hands and forearms. Isaac Bingham testified next about seeing Luther's empty wagon near the women's cabin that morning. James Walsh, the salesman, described encountering Luther on the road shortly before noon, upset and messy. Helen Pritchett recounted hearing shouting from the direction of the cabin around midday, followed by silence. Each witness added another piece to a circumstantial but compelling picture. Hutchkins rested his case after 3 days, having presented evidence of opportunity, presence, and planning through Luther's documented threats. He had carefully avoided introducing the women's letters or discussing their relationship beyond stating they were longtime companions who shared a household. Samuel Birch's defense strategy became clear from his opening statement. He did not dispute that Luther had killed the women. Instead, he reframed it as an act of desperate moral intervention. Luther Holcomb is guilty of taking 2 lives, Birch acknowledged. But the question before you is not whether he killed them. It is whether his actions, however tragic, were driven by circumstances that would make any God-fearing man act similarly. Then Birch did what Hutchkins had feared. He made Sarah and Ida's relationship the centerpiece of his defense. He called witnesses who testified to seeing the women displaying inappropriate affection. He read passages from scripture condemning unnatural relations. He argued that Luther, as the last male member of Sarah's immediate family, had a moral and religious duty to step in when she fell into what he repeatedly called sinful deviance. Reverend Keepart was called to testify, reluctantly confirming that Luther had asked the church to counsel Sarah about her lifestyle. When Hutchins cross-examined, asking if the Reverend had found the women to be immoral, Keepart paused for a long moment before answering. "I found them to be devoted to each other and faithful members of the congregation. What happened in their private lives was between them and God." It was the strongest defense of the women anyone offered during the trial, and it came too late to matter. Luther took the stand on the fourth day. His testimony, recorded in full by the court stenographer, revealed a man who believed absolutely in the righteousness of his actions. He described how he had gone to the cabin that morning, intending only to talk. He claimed Sarah had threatened him with the shotgun. He said things had gotten out of hand and that he had acted in the moment to protect his family's honor and his sister's children from the stain of scandal. When Hutchins asked him directly if he had killed both women, Luther showed no hesitation. "I did what needed doing. They refused to listen to reason, to scripture, to common decency. I gave them every opportunity to change their ways." "So you murdered them because they wouldn't obey you?" Hutchins pressed. "I removed immoral corruption from my family," Luther replied calmly. "If that's murder, then yes." The courtroom erupted. Judge Caldwell's gavel cracked like a rifle shot as he restored order, but the damage was done. Luther's confession was complete, his justification laid bare. The only question remaining was whether the jury would find his reasoning persuasive enough to show mercy. Closing arguments began the next morning, and the battle for the jury's sympathy reached its peak. Samuel Birch stood before the jury on December 12th with the confidence of a man who understood his audience. He spoke for nearly 2 hours, his voice rising and falling with practiced rhythm, weaving together scripture, social rules, and sympathy for a man he portrayed as tortured by impossible circumstances. "Gentlemen of the jury," he began, "Luther Holcomb sits before you not as a criminal, but as a man who faced a moral crisis that would test any person of faith. His sister had died, leaving 5 children motherless. His sister-in-law, the natural choice to care for those children, refused her duty. Why? Because she had chosen to live in a manner that defied God's law, natural law, and the basic expectations of decent society. Birch painted Sarah and Ida as the aggressors in this tragedy, women who had deliberately flouted community standards and religious teaching. He described Luther's attempts to reason with them, to appeal to Sarah's family obligation, to save her soul from damnation. Each refusal, Birch argued, deepened Luther's desperation and confirmed the depths of their moral corruption. What was this man to do? Birch asked the jury. Watch his sister's children grow up with the stain of their aunt's scandal hanging over them. Allow the family name to be destroyed by association with perversion. He tried every righteous path available to him. He spoke to them directly. He sought the church's intervention. He pleaded with them to consider the children. They refused him at every turn. Then Birch made his most crucial argument. He suggested that on that October morning, when Luther went to the cabin one final time, Sarah had indeed threatened him with the shotgun. In defending himself, things had escalated beyond his control. He is guilty of taking life, Birch conceded, but he is not guilty of murder in the coldest sense. He acted in a moment of passion, driven by righteous anger, and perhaps fear for his own safety. This is not planned killing. This is manslaughter born of impossible circumstances. The jury listened intently. Several nodded during Birch's argument. When he finished and took his seat, the courtroom remained silent for several seconds before Judge Caldwell called for a break. William Hutchins faced the jury that afternoon, knowing he had lost ground. Birch's strategy had been effective, appealing to every prejudice and fear that men of that era had about women who lived independently. Hutchins had one opportunity to counter it, and he chose his words carefully. "Mr. Birch, would have you believe this case is about morality?" Hutchins began quietly. "That Luther Holcomb was an agent of righteousness forced to terrible action by women who refused to conform. But this case is not about morality. It is about power. About a man who believed his authority over women was absolute and what happened when 2 women refused to submit to that authority." Hutchins walked the jury through the evidence systematically, the documented threats spanning months, the sheriff's reports showing escalating harassment, the witnesses who heard Luther promise to end the situation one way or another, the coroner's testimony proving the women had been attacked with overwhelming force, their defensive wounds showing they had tried desperately to protect themselves. "The defense wants you to believe Sarah threatened Luther with a shotgun," Hutchins said. "Yet that shotgun was never found. No evidence of any struggle inside the cabin suggests Luther was defending himself. The evidence shows 2 women who were pursued, attacked, and killed because they refused to obey a man who had no legal authority over their lives." He paused, looking at each juror in turn. "Luther Holcomb has confessed to killing Sarah Holcomb and Ida Whitfield. He does not deny it. He is proud of it. He told you from that witness stand that he removed a moral corruption. Gentlemen, that is not self-defense. That is not manslaughter born of passion. That is planned murder carried out by a man who believed he had the right to execute women for the crime of living as they chose." Hutchins could see that some jurors were uncomfortable with his framing. He shifted tactics slightly, appealing to law rather than empathy. "You may not approve of how these women lived. You may find their choices difficult to understand or accept. But the law does not give any man the right to kill another person for moral offenses, real or imagined. If we allow that principle to stand, none of us are safe. Anyone who offends someone else's sense of morality becomes a potential target for violence. The prosecutor argued that he had taken the women's lives with intent. The evidence is overwhelming. His own confession confirms it. Your duty is not to judge the victims' lives. Your duty is to judge the defendant's actions under the law. And the law is clear. This is murder. The jury retired to deliberate at 400 on December 12th. The courtroom remained packed with spectators who refused to leave, afraid of missing the verdict. Outside, the crowd in the square had grown to more than 300 people. Sheriff Yates positioned deputies throughout the area, anticipating trouble regardless of the outcome. The jury deliberated through dinner. As evening fell and lamps were lit in the courthouse, speculation mounted. A quick verdict would likely mean conviction. The longer they deliberated, the more likely they were deadlocked or considering the lesser charge of manslaughter. At 7:15 that evening, the jury sent word that they had reached a verdict. Judge Caldwell reconvened the court. The foreman, a hardware store owner named Joseph Kilpatrick, stood when asked. His face revealed nothing. In the matter of the state versus Luther Holcomb, Judge Caldwell said, "Or does the jury find?" Kilpatrick's voice carried through the silent courtroom. "We find the defendant guilty of manslaughter." The reaction was immediate and divided. Some in the gallery gasped, others nodded in approval. Constance Riddle, sitting in the back row, began to weep quietly. Luther Holcomb showed no emotion whatsoever, as if the verdict confirmed exactly what he had expected. The manslaughter verdict meant Luther Holcomb faced a maximum sentence of 15 years rather than execution or life imprisonment. Judge Caldwell scheduled sentencing for December 19th, giving himself a week to consider the appropriate punishment. That week revealed just how deeply the verdict had fractured the community. The Watauga Democrat published competing editorials. One praised the jury's wisdom in recognizing the mitigating circumstances that had driven Luther to violence. Another condemned the verdict as a betrayal of justice, arguing that 2 women had been murdered and the killer would serve minimal time. Letters flooded the newspaper office, running 3-1 in support of the lighter conviction. Constance Riddle received anonymous threats for her continued advocacy for the victims. Someone painted the word deviant on the fence outside her home. When she reported this to Sheriff Yates, he told her there was little he could do without witnesses. The message was clear. Her defense of Sarah and Ida had made her a target, and the law would not protect her. William Hutchkins, devastated by what he viewed as a failure, seriously considered leaving the practice of law. In letters to his brother, he wrote, "I presented overwhelming evidence of planned murder." Luther confessed from the stand, yet the jury chose to see him as a victim of circumstance rather than a killer of defenseless women. On December 19th, the courtroom filled once more for sentencing. Luther stood before Judge Caldwell, still showing no remorse. Caldwell asked if he wished to address the court before sentencing. Luther's response would be quoted in newspapers across North Carolina. "I am guilty only of doing what any Christian man would do when faced with such corruption in his family." Luther said, "I regret that it came to violence, but I do not regret protecting my sister's children from shame." Judge Caldwell's face remained expressionless as he delivered the sentence, 12 years in the state penitentiary. The courtroom erupted in mixed reactions. Some felt it was too harsh for a man who had acted to defend family honor. Others, including the small group of women who had advocated for justice, felt it was shamefully inadequate for the murder of 2 people. Luther was transported to Central Prison in Raleigh the following week. Prison records show he was a model inmate, attending chapel services regularly and causing no disciplinary problems. In 1910, after serving only 6 years, he was released for good behavior. He returned to Watauga County briefly to collect his sister's children, then moved to Tennessee, where he remarried and lived quietly until his death in 1932. Sarah and Ida's cabin was sold at auction in 1906 to pay outstanding property taxes that no family member would settle. In July of 1907, the cabin burned to the ground. No investigation determined the cause, though several witnesses reported seeing smoke late one evening. By morning, nothing remained but the stone chimney and blackened foundation. The county seemed eager to forget what had happened. Official records from the period mentioned the case only briefly, often referring to Sarah and Ida as the unfortunate spinsters, without naming them directly. Their relationship was never acknowledged in any public document. The letters Hutchkins had wanted to introduce as evidence disappeared from the sheriff's office sometime in 1908. Within a generation, the story had faded from collective memory, becoming one more tragedy in the hard history of the Appalachian Mountains. For 94 years, Sarah Holcomb and Ida Whitfield remained footnotes in Watauga County history, their story reduced to whispers and half-remembered fragments. Then, in the spring of 1998, everything changed. Rachel Kowalski, a graduate student studying women's history in Appalachia, was researching land ownership patterns in rural North Carolina when she discovered the deed listing Sarah and Ida as joint property owners. The term, spinster companions, caught her attention. Further investigation led her to the brief newspaper accounts of their deaths and Luther's trial, which mentioned the women only in passing and provided no details about their relationship. But Kowalski was persistent. She requested access to the county archives, where boxes of documents from the early 1900s had been stored and largely forgotten. Among them, she found the coroner's report that contradicted the accidental death narrative some sources suggested. She found Sheriff Yates's logbook documenting Sarah's complaints about Luther's threats. Most significantly, she found a metal file box labeled simply Case 1904. Inside were the letters, dozens of them, correspondence between Sarah and Ida spanning from 1899 to 1904. They had been locked away for nearly a century, preserved by accident rather than intent. Kowalski spent 3 days reading them in the archive room, and by the end, she was crying. "My dearest heart," Sarah had written. "When I wake beside you, I understand what it means to be truly alive." Ida's letters were equally explicit. "I would rather face damnation with you than salvation without you." These were not the words of casual friends or simple household companions. They were love letters, passionate and clear, documenting a romantic relationship that had lasted at least 5 years before the women's deaths. Kowalski's dissertation, published in 2001, brought Sarah and Ida's story back into public consciousness. Local historians in Watauga County began re-examining the case with fresh perspective. The Watauga County Historical Society organized an exhibit in 2003 featuring the letters, photographs of the property deed, and documentation of the trial. The response was overwhelming. Descendants of people involved in the case came forward with family stories that had been suppressed for generations. Constance Riddle's granddaughter shared her grandmother's private journals, which detailed the threats and rejection Constance had faced for defending the women. Even some of Luther Holcomb's descendants expressed regret for what their ancestor had done, though others maintained he had acted within the moral standards of his time. In 2007, a group of local activists erected a memorial marker near where Sarah and Ida's cabin once stood. The inscription reads, "Sarah Elizabeth Holcomb and Ida Mae Whitfield. They lived with courage. They died together. They are remembered." Their actual graves, separated in different family plots as their families had insisted, now receive regular visitors. People leave flowers, stones, small tokens of remembrance. The women who were buried in shame, whose love was erased from official memory, have become symbols of strength and the cost of living authentically in a world that demanded conformity. The story that Watauga County tried to forget has become the story it finally chose to remember. Sarah and Ida's love, which 19th century society called sinful and unnatural, is now recognized for what it always was: genuine, profound, and worth honoring. They paid the ultimate price for refusing to hide who they were. History has finally given them the dignity they were denied in life. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that love has always existed even in the darkest times and most hostile places, click the like button and subscribe. These forgotten histories need to be told, and your support helps ensure they reach the people who need to hear them. Share this video with someone who appreciates stories of courage against impossible odds. Sarah and Ida's memory deserves to live on.